I'm sure people would. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. I'm Phil Sumption from the Organic Growers Alliance, and I'm really delighted that we're able to run this webinar on a subject which is very close to my heart. And we've been far too long as organic growers on grappling with the peat issue, and it's about time that we sort it, and we can sort it ourselves, and we can do that by with our own bespoke growing media. At least that's the plan. We will see how difficult that is as we go through. But I'm also very pleased to have some of my old colleagues with me. I won't say old too much. So Margie Lennoxson was at CAWR, and also Francis Rains and Judith Conroy, who are also at the Centre for Agroecology, Water and Resilience at Coventry, and have been working a lot on the peat-free issue as part of Organic Plus. And also, most of you will know, but there may be many people here who don't. You know Iain Tolhurst, who is a very well-known organic grower and very innovative, and has been working with woodchip composting and peat-free growing media for a very long time. So it's great to have him with us. Just a little bit about the program. This webinar program, if those of you are not familiar with, is a joint partnership between the CSA Network UK, the Seed Sovereignty Programme of the UK and Ireland, and the Land Workers Alliance, and ourselves, the Organic Growers Alliance. So, and it's funded by the Farming the Future, and they've been funding it since lockdown. So we had a whole series last year, and we're running them last Wednesday of the month, and we've got a program running through this year as well. So many of you have joined us before. If you haven't, then great welcome. If you're not a member of any of the organisations, then do think about it, and then you can get a discount off them. You can get a free entry to these webinars right through the year, and also lots of other benefits from each individual organisation. So yeah, that's I'll keep it very brief at that, and just say that a little bit of housekeeping. We are going to run this webinar to 8:30, so it will end promptly at 8:30. We've got loads of people on the call, 182 at present. It may be more, and so questions are going to be difficult to manage. We'll try our best to answer as many as we can. If you've got general chat, then you can use, if you've got links that you want to share with anybody else, or want to introduce yourselves, do that in the chat. If you've got your own recipes for growing media mixes, then please feel free to put those in the chat. But if questions are to the panelists, if you can put those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and then we'll try and direct them directly to the panelists as they either after they finish or at the end of all of the talks. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to now hand over to Judith, who's going to kick us off. You're muted, Judith.
I'm going to share my screen. I'll do that first.
And this is being recorded for people coming in, and it will be available afterwards.
Can everyone see my slides okay?
Yep.
Brilliant. But yeah, it's absolutely brilliant to see everybody here. I can see on the chat then all the people picking up from all the different organisations, some of who we know around the country and further and beyond. So yeah, thank you everybody for coming. It's really good to see you all. So there's my slide changed. Oh, my slides aren't moving. Right, I can do it by touch screen. So just a really quick agenda. I won't spend ages talking about what we're going to talk about, but I'm just going to do quite a brief potted history of the use of peat and the work that's been done so far towards a phase out. Then I'm going to hand over to Tolly. He's going to give us the grower's perspective of all the work he's been doing, producing his own compost, working with researchers as well to improve the situation. Then I'm going to hand over to Francis. He's going to talk about the work that we've done at Coventry and with our partner organisations on looking at alternatives to peat. And then Margie is going to talk a bit about the responsible sourcing scheme, which is an industry initiative, but it's going to look at lots of the different ingredients that make up growing media, including peat. Obviously, a lot of those could be used by growers. And she's having a look as well at taking Tolly's material through the calculator as well. And then we'll have the discussion and questions afterwards. So if I just go straight in, then just to give a brief potted history, sorry about the pun, potted history of peat. But really, we've probably not been using peat for as long as a lot of people imagine. In the heydays of the Victorian garden, when head gardeners were innovating and making their own potting mix, I've no doubt that some of them perhaps did use a bit of peat, but it really wasn't widespread. It wasn't until the 1930s that the John Innes Centre developed potting mixes that contained some peat, but even then it was only quite a small percentage. Then in the 1940s, we got ready-made growing media, and they had a peat content as well, but again, it still wasn't a huge proportion. And then through the 20th century, we got, the scaling up of people growing containerised plants for sale rather than bare root, or rather than people growing their own, as we started to get more sort of convenience products hit the market. And it wasn't really until the 1960s that we started to get peat being sold to consumers and to growers, in fact, in any great kind of quantity. Obviously, being lightweight and easier to transport, it's I suppose it's easier to sell than a lot of other grain media would be. So yeah, it wasn't until the 60s that we got lots of peat being sold. And then throughout the 1970s, kind of the rise of the garden centre and maybe kind of the start of destination shopping with cafes and things like that, both sales of bagged growing media and sales of plants grown in peat increased even more and more. By the 1980s, we started to get the first major concerns about the use of peat in horticulture. It was a campaign that David Bellamy was involved with kind of at the end of the 80s, early 90s. So then during the 1990s, there started to be some research done on alternatives to peat, mostly on a slightly smaller scale, possibly using things that, I suppose another situation at that time was there were waste materials that were a concern, organic waste materials that we wanted to find a use for. So that kind of fitted quite well with the search of an alternative to peat. Through the early 2000s, there was more government funding and more successful alternatives to peat started to come onto the market. I think Melcourt's been up and running for kind of a good 20, 25 years now. So you started to get that happening. And then more recently, we started to get more moves actually towards the government proposing a phase out of peat, or the use of peat in horticulture at any rate. So that just gives you a quick setting of the scene as to how long we've been using peat for. Quite an interesting thing to look at in the last 10 years. This was a report produced by the Horticultural Trades Association, and I think on the list of resources on the last slide, I think there's a link to the full document. But quite interestingly, in the last decade, growing media producers have been looking to reduce the percentage of growing media that's in mixes, and it has indeed fallen quite a lot. Slightly, not anomalous, but with COVID, these figures only got to 2020, but between 2019 and 2020, the actual volume of peat in total that was sold actually increased. But that's because there was an increase of over a third in overall growing media sales, because a lot more people took up gardening. So the graph accounts for all sectors, but just we have got that slightly anomalous uplift due to COVID of more home gardeners. So although the content of peat in mixes has been reducing fairly significantly, almost 20% over 10 years, it's still, it has gone up with COVID. Another timeline. So this is focusing more on the steps to phase out peat. Kind of a bit early, 1992. That's when we started to get anything kind of remotely government related. So in 1992, the plant charity Plant Life initiated a commission of inquiry, which I think is a House of Lords vehicle. So there was an inquiry into peat and peatlands. And around the same time, HGRA, which is now Garden Organic, they released their organic gardening charter. So it's not kind of the same as the organic standards of the Soil Association. It's more of a kind of thing for gardeners to sign up to themselves or choose to adhere to themselves. But in their guidelines, Garden Organic said no peat, sort of back in 1992. We didn't really get any movement from government until about 10 years ago. So we had some targets introduced, which are on there. You can see 2015 for local authorities, that's been and gone. Amateur gardening 2020, that's been and gone. But there is still the target of removing peat from professional horticulture by 2030. So obviously there's a few things in place that mean that we might still get there with an actual ban on peat. As a reaction to those 2011 targets, the Sustainable Growing Media Task Force was established. So that was an industry vehicle where various organisations got together, and Margie will talk more about this. But they came up with the device of the responsible sourcing scheme. So looking at not just peat, but all ingredients in growing media to grade them in terms of their environmental responsibility. It's quite a slow burner. In 2015, DEFRA, I think it was at the end of 2014, they were meant to produce a review, but because their 25-year plan that was being prepared, they kind of postponed that review. In 2016, the responsible sourcing calculator was actually launched. And this had been going on for 5 years already, since 2011, but it was kind of a soft launch. It was launched within the industry, so the industry itself could kind of look at it, but it wasn't released to the general public for quite some time. In 2018, DEFRA did release their 25-year plan, but they did reaffirm their commitment to phase out peat by 2030. And then in 2020, we had a government climate report, and that again emphasised the role of peatlands, particularly in the sequestration of carbon dioxide. And it seemed to be that the argument for keeping carbon in the ground seemed to be a bigger winner for peatlands than the argument of habitat had been. And the role in, I mean, all these things matter for peatlands. They're great at retaining, helping to attenuate floodwater as well. But the carbon arguments seem to really get more traction. Just added in there, it's not really an event, but the Soil Association standards do have in there that they're looking to phase out peat by 2025, and they were updated last in October of 2021. So we do have that move by the organic movement and Soil Association, which is one of the biggest certifiers to do that. And then this year, 2022, the responsible sourcing calculator was actually launched to the UK public. So from this growing season, you'll actually see at the point of sale, and again, Margie will talk about this more, but you will actually see a gauge at the point of sale to say how responsibly sourced different growing media are. So yeah, we're still kind of looking, not looking at anything concrete, but there are things happening, and certainly more's happened in the last 10 years than had done previously. So your potted history. But yeah, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. I'm going to hand over to Tolly, who can tell you about his perspective. I did include a slide here, and I think we can share the slides afterwards. But we, the crowd of us at Coventry, we did go and spend the day with Tolly, and we spoke to him about his media. So there is a YouTube video about that. So yeah, I'll put that link in the chat actually. But yeah, I'll stop sharing. There it is. Hand over to Iain.
Oh, I better unmute. Can you hear me okay? Right, I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this is going to work. Right, yeah, I've been messing about on this job for a very long time, and I kind of started way back about the time that suddenly peat started to get a bit of a reputation, because at one point, nobody really gave a thought about this. So we started some trials in '87, and it was pretty messy. We tried just about everything we could get our hands on, We looked at cocoa waste, which has a huge problem. Leaf mold. Leaf mold actually was one of the things which did turn out to have quite a bit of promise, and I still think it has promise. So the difficulty really, I suppose, is sourcing it, because you may well end up having to rob forest leaf mold in order to make your compost. There's an issue around that. We did a lot of work with steam sterilized soil, which actually did work quite well. So we were sort of imitating the John Innes mixes using sterilized soil. We had vast piles of soil left around here at Harbuck when we came here from a previous tenant who just kind of piled it up with loads of plastic. So we had quite a good source of soil. And this did actually work quite well, but we were using it with leaf mold and bracken. We bought a load of bracken from Cornwall, and that sort of worked fairly well. We tried sawdust, that was a disaster. And then we had to find something to try and open this material up. So we looked at gravel and sand and other things. But the main problem really was the lack of consistency. Every time we mix, we got a different result. And we generally got pretty poor results. You know, it was really difficult to get good plants. So we were looking around for something else. Then green waste compost turned up. There was one of the first sites in the UK was not far from where we are now in South Oxfordshire. So we bought a few bags of that, and that really showed a lot of promise. On its own, it wasn't very good, but if we mixed it with some perlite or vermiculite, and we were using a bit of organic feed as well, and that was actually working quite well. And we've gone on from there. Once we discovered making our own compost, we found that has been absolutely perfect, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. So the other thing I want to point out really, and everybody's forgotten about peg plants, but everyone's hell bent on raising modules, but there's another way of raising plants, and that's by doing plants in soil, peg plants as they used to be called, and that's how most growers did it when I started. I mean, modules only came around in the mid-70s as a result of work being done with supermarkets, and up to that point, everybody grew everything pretty much as a peg plant. Very few plants were grown as modules. And it has some big advantages. They're very cheap to grow. So we grow more than half of our plants. We do around 120,000 plants a year. We grow more than half of them as peg plants, particularly leeks and all the winter brassica. They're very easy and cheap to grow, very cost effective. I've done some costings on this, and the cost is less than a third of the cost of raising plants in modules. So I think people need to perhaps revisit this and see what possibilities there are. If you're only growing very small amounts of plants, then this may not be an option. But for growers doing, tens of thousands, this is a really cheap way of growing plants. A few examples there: a 30-meter row, and we're looking at one of our tunnels, and they are 30-meter rows. One row of leeks is between 2,000 and 2,500 plants. Now you think how much space that would take up in a propagation greenhouse with trays, and how much energy and compost and inputs and support mechanisms you need to do that, whereas you can do it very easily in a tunnel. In fact, some of it we do outdoors. So something really people need to think about is the use of peg plants. Right, the actual recipe, and this is, I suppose, the bit that most people really want to see, and it's unbelievably simple. When I first started it, I think we tried to make it complicated because we thought it had to be complicated, and the wood chip has really made this whole process a lot easier, because the wood chip contains pretty much everything we need, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But the compost is very simple. It's 4 parts of wood chip to 1.5 parts of vermiculite, or you could use perlite. We've chosen to use vermiculite primarily because it's better in terms of water retention, but also has a slightly lower carbon footprint. And the reason we use vermiculite is twofold. One is to dilute the wood chip. The wood chip is very high in nutrients. It's actually too high in nutrients. So this is a way of diluting the nutrient. But also wood chip is not great in terms of water holding capacity. It's not as good as peat. In fact, nothing's as good as peat. This is the problem. Nothing is as good as peat for holding water. And this is what we're up against. So we're using vermiculite as that medium to help retain the water. It's worked very well. It's the only material input which I'm slightly concerned about, because there is a carbon footprint with this. It's coming from Portugal. We'd rather not be importing it, so we are still looking around for local alternatives to vermiculite. And to that, if we're growing alliums are particularly difficult because they're in trays for a long time. In fact, we've gone more to peg plants because it's so much easier. We only grow some very speciality alliums in trays. And for those, we found that we need to use some organic fertilizer. We use an animal-free fertilizer in order to keep enough nutrient going for a period of time. Because of the way that wood chip compost works, it tends to lose nutrient relatively quickly. So it's great for brassicas, it's fantastic for lettuce and tomatoes and peppers, but it doesn't work so well for alliums. You can grow them, they just don't get to a very good size. So I've put the quantities there. It's either in parts or in bucket loads. We use a bucket, a 15-litre bucket, for measuring it out. And this is where we mix it up. It's one of our old buildings. It's actually a cricket pavilion. It was put up in 1890, and we've kind of used it as our garden shed. The compost comes from the field. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. It goes through the grader, which you see, the Shepak grader you see on the left-hand side. We used to do it by sieves, but it's quite hard work, takes quite a bit of energy. So we bought a rotary sieve. This is really fast, it's really quick. And we can change the setting for either 10 or 20 millimeter. We usually do 10 millimeter. So the material goes through there, depending on the quality of the wood chip, the raw material. It depends how well it goes through, but we make sure it's fairly dry. We keep our wood chip compost covered during the winter. So when we bring it into the shed, it's dry, it sieves really easily. It comes out like black dust. It's the most beautiful material. We mix it in the concrete mixer. You'll see there it goes in. So we're chucking the wood chip compost in there along with the vermiculite. We may occasionally add a tiny amount of water, but it's usually we usually get the moisture content just right without doing that, but we do occasionally have to put water in. We've done blocking with this material. This stuff blocks fantastically well. It's really great. The only problem for us is blocking is quite labor intensive, and it's not something we really think we can do unless we were doing it on a much larger scale or on a very small scale. So the mixing is straightforward. In the background, you see that kind of galvanized bin thing. That's been in that shed for, I think, 50 years. It's a steam sterilizer. We never use it anymore. It's wickedly expensive to run. It's 15 kilowatt. But that's where we used to sterilize our loam, and it works really well. And the beauty of sterilizing loam is you get a massive hit of nitrogen as a result. So you get really rapid growth, and you have complete freedom from weed seeds. So I wouldn't dismiss completely the use of sterilized loam. I think it does have a place to play, but of course, if you sterilize loam, you kill all the biological activity completely. And I think the way our compost works is because it's fungal rich. Right, I've done a bit of costings on this, and I've just kind of revisited this a few weeks ago to check on my costings because the last one was done 10 years ago. The cost of this is not huge. It's pretty much equivalent to buying in, depends on what sort of quantities you're buying in, but it's certainly not more expensive. We could reduce the cost of this. We do have quite a bit of handling of this material. To get it to our mixing area, we have to barrow it from a tractor and trailer 50 yards away because we can't get close enough. So we could cut down on the amount of time used in order to make this material, but even with this added labor, it's still quite competitive with buying in. In fact, I'm not sure what current prices are, but I do recall a few years ago we were marginally cheaper than buying in. So even allowing for all the labor and the cost of additional materials, which isn't that great, it still comes out quite cost effective. So there's no financial argument against this at the moment. The raw ingredient is really important, and this is the critical factor. And we're taking a whole range of wood chips, mostly, I wouldn't say exclusively, but 70% is a deciduous material. We could have a whole seminar about this process, so I'm going to have to keep it short, but we're composting this. We're also using some of our own material. We're using some of our own round mill chip wood for compost making as well, and that's also finding its way into our substrate mixes. This process is important, and it takes at least a year and a half to get this up to a point where we feel comfortable to use it in propagation. And we're looking at CN ratios really of around between 10 and 12 to 1, and that seems to work really well. At that point, the material is like dust. There'll still be some lumps of wood in it because some of this wood doesn't rot, and that's where we put it through the grader to take out the big pieces. But the actual production of this raw material is really important, and this material we turn 4 times with a mini digger. Here it is. You can see here's a heap which has been around for quite a while. It's quite well broken down. We build windrows. It composts well in a windrow, and the process of turning it 4 times mixes everything up. So where we've got different types of trees, because there's a whole range of trees, we're mixing the whole thing up. So we're not getting a batch of just one particular species. It's a whole range of species. We do try to limit how much conifer goes in there. We don't really want anything more than about 1/3. Leylandi is the problem. Everybody's getting rid of Leylandi, but we have told our tree surgeon who lives locally not to bring too much. Here we are loading up much better. This is actually going on the field. What we use on the field is a much more raw and not so well broken down material. But where we're using it for propagation, we put it to one side and we leave it for another 6 to 8 months to complete the process. So, we demand a lot from this material, this substrate. I'm never sure whether it's substrate, compost, media or what, but substrate. We need nutrient, we need moisture holding, it has to be light. That was one of the reasons we went to vermiculite and perlite, because we were using gravel before, and you cannot pick up a crate of 4-inch pots with gravel and peat and compost in. They're really, really heavy. So, lightness is important. No weeds, and we get virtually no weeds in our material, providing we've handled the compost properly, turned it properly, and kept it covered. The weed burden is very, very low. I wouldn't say it's nil. We had 1 year when it was a bit of a nightmare, but that was contamination from a source that we know about. But it's generally very clean. It has to be renewable, which we are. We can grow our own compost if we want to, if we've got the trees. It has to be cheap, it has to be available. We're asking a great deal of this material, we really are. I mean, to try and then stuff it into a tiny pot and expect a plant to grow for quite a long period of time is a tall order. The picture there is tomatoes. This would have been taken probably about middle of March. Yes, it's about 3 weeks from now. Everything looks great. We've never actually had, and this may sound quite incredible, we've never had a plant failure. We've grown 1 million plants in this stuff, and we've never had a failure in terms of a crop. We may have lost a few odd plants here and there. We've never had a failed crop. We've had failed crops when we plant them out afterwards in the field, but we've never had a failure in terms of the actual plant propagation part. We very occasionally get a tiny bit of damping off, particularly beetroot when we do multi-seeded beetroot, and that's usually because it's too early, it's too cold, it's too damp. But apart from that, we've never ever had a failure of any one crop. There's a really good trial which you can look up, and it's in OGA 29. There's an article which covers the trial that was done by the Innovative Farming Programme. It's well covered on the agroecology website. We looked at our compost and compared it with Classman. I won't bore you too much with all the facts and figures, but we had some really interesting results. And comparing the analysis of our compost with that of Classman was like comparing chalk with cheese. The wood chip substrate is the green one. The dark green is with biochar. The pale green is just the wood chip on its own. And the orange one is the Classman and Classman with biochar. And you can see in terms of nitrogen, I mean, we're off the scale there compared with Classman. This is why, we have to dilute it, because it's very, very rich in N. The same goes for other nutrients as well. Potassium, we have a huge amount of potassium, and that's pretty common with wood material. Other minor elements sort of compare favorably, but the difference between wood chip material and Classman is quite vast. And if you were a large commercial plant propagator and you looked at this analysis, you would say there's no way I'm ever going to grow a plant with that material, because it just doesn't look right. And it just goes to show how the nutrient content is not that important. What's important is the fungal biological activity. That's how this works. This material works because it's fungally rich. Right, that's the end. I probably might have finished on time, have I, Phil? For a change? Yeah? Wow. This is our farm shop, by the way, which I love putting the picture out. That's a lovely picture. One of my neighbours took this one day. Right, so that's it. Good, done.
Okay, thank you, Tolly. I think we've got a few questions, but I think we've because some of them I think will come up as we go through the the next talks with looking at different materials that go into growing media, I think we'll wait to the end and see if we still, if those questions haven't been answered, then we can address them there if that's okay. So yeah, who's next, Judith?
It's me.
It's Francis. So yeah.
So I don't know if you can do the slides, Judith.
Yeah.
No.
Hang on. I need to go back.
You're getting a preview now of.
Yeah, sneak preview. There we go.
All right then. So I'm going to speak. Oh, yeah. I'm going to speak on behalf of the of Coventry University, because where we've done work which follows on in many ways with quite a few of us used to work for the Henry Doubleday Research Association, and so in many ways the work that we're now doing at Coventry University really builds on that foundation. We're the part of the university where we work is the Centre for Agroecology, Water and Resilience, or CAWR, and Margie Leonardson works some of the time for CAWR and some of the time for the RHS, which is why the RHS logo is on that slide as well. So we can move on, Judith. The work that we're going to mention is part of this Organic Plus project, and this is a big European funded project. There are partners in, you can see them highlighted there in 25 different 25 different partners in a whole range of different countries across Europe. And it's all concerned with contentious inputs. So this is contentious inputs in organic agriculture more generally. So both horticulture and arable farming and animal production as well. So it's quite a broad ranging project in its wider remit. But perhaps of particular interest to growers is the work that we're sort of focusing on at Coventry. More at the horticultural end, we're looking at alternatives to the use of plastic mulches primarily for weed suppression. We're looking at alternatives to the use of animal byproducts as sources of fertility in protected cropping and also in field vegetable production. But what we're really focusing on today is thinking of alternatives to the use of peat, and we've obviously had an introduction to that. And so we're doing experiments at Coventry. We've also got partners in Spain, Greece, Turkey, Germany, and Norway that are also doing trials and investigations into these as well. And you can see all the kind of the logos of the partners there at the bottom of the screen. I have to say as well that this is a kind of a work in progress. We've still got some experiments going on. To some extent, we were delayed a bit by the COVID pandemic. It made it difficult for people to come into work and get on with things, and particularly to do some of the laboratory analysis that we'd hoped to do, as I'm sure you'll understand. But that's kind of the team of people working on it. And what we're looking at several different aspects of this concerned with these peat alternatives. Tolly has already said a bit about composting and the use of wood chip compost. Us and our partners, we're also looking at composting other materials, particularly other waste materials. So there's quite a lot of attention being paid to various different sorts of prunings. This picture at the bottom left hand that you can see, that's in Turkey. That's where they're composting olive prunings, which there are quite a lot of, and also there are lots of other materials, and it could be apple twig prunings as well, I suppose. We're also looking at, or some of our partners are looking at, these other materials, forest biomass, which sounds a bit of not a very environmentally sustainable thing. That's actually material they've gathered up in Spain to stop forest fires. They have to kind of clear the undergrowth. It's interesting. Tolly mentioned, kind of sort of the danger of denuding the woodland if you gathered up leaf mold. Well, this is kind of a case where maybe that would be possibly more acceptable. But indeed, you can compost, these kind of more woody things with many other materials. It could be grass, it could be kind of vegetable wastes, could be manures. There's a whole range of things that can be composted. So that's one side of things that we're looking at. We've also got another group of partners that are very interested in extruded materials. And this picture of this machine is an extrusion device, which is and this is a way of processing wood fibers. It's used to produce the kind of fibers that go into MDF, kind of fiberboard in the kind of, sort of the engineered timber production. But it can also be used to process kind of coppiced wood chipped material that could be used, it could be of value as a growing medium. So that's a whole other side of things, the extrusion, the use of extruded materials. They are already used. Some extruded material is already used in commercially available growing media in the conventional sector. So it's not entirely a novel idea, but we'll say a little bit more about that later on. And we've done, us and our partners have done a whole series of growth trials looking at the use of various blends of composted, extruded, and other ingredients, both in terms of vegetable transplants. You can see there at the bottom, I think there's some sort of brassica growing there, and indeed containerized plants. They're olive tree seedlings grown at the top there. So that's the type of work that we're doing. So we can move on. We started off by doing a bit of a survey, which I think some of you might have participated in. It was a survey in the OGA magazine, just to find out what materials were currently used by growers in DIY growing media. And the most popular one, at least in our survey, was some sort of compost, either variously described, but kind of garden made from, sort of basically homemade green waste compost, or involving some sort of vegetable kitchen waste, that kind of thing. That was the front runner in terms of what people use. Others, then there was some of them have already been mentioned: the leaf mold, the wood chip, indeed, the CAWR, soil or loam. That's obviously a kind of a traditional, staple that used to be widely used, often kind of discounted on the grounds of the weightiness of it, which perhaps makes it less suitable as a bagged product. But either sort of soil on its own mixed with some sort of sand or gravel or grit. Some people included a bit of peat in their homemade mixtures, and then also the things like perlite and which have been used to lighten the product. So there's quite a diversity of materials that are being used already, and of course there are different combinations of these things. There's it doesn't kind of add up to 100%. There's a long list of, some people use more than one ingredient, clearly. But so that was kind of a bit of a background, just to find out what the status quo was. Our experimental work that we've been doing in the UK has really focused on sort of developing this idea from Tolly, to find out a little bit more about it, to perhaps explore it more and put it on a more of a scientific foundation, because it is a kind of, as Tolly has said, it is some people don't believe that it would work. Some people think that it wouldn't have any nutrients in. So we've done some more kind of academic studies that we can kind of publish and get the information about that about a little bit more widely. And one particular thing that we've been interested in doing is to explore other things that can be added rather than the vermiculite, because this obviously is a contentious input in its own right. And if that could be eliminated, that would be a good thing. So we can just move on, and I'm not going to sort of dwell hugely on the results, because as I say, some of these experiments are kind of are ongoing. But in this particular set of trials, you can see we had composted composted wood chip, which we mixed either with vermiculite at 10, 20 or 30%, or we mixed it with extruded poplar wood at 10, 20 or 30%. And in this set of trials, we used Melcourt silver mix as the kind of control, conventional control, you might call it. Obviously, it was organically acceptable, but it's but yeah, that's a commercial media that we use to compare it with. And we used both lettuce and leeks as a test crop. And the first interesting thing is that the commercial Melcourt compost, certainly in terms of the lettuces, didn't perform very well in terms of the germination. All the growing media based on wood chip, they all did really well. They all got to near enough 100%, but the standard commercial mixture didn't do so well in that case. With leeks, there was a similar sort of pattern, but it was much less clear cut. But I think it's true to say that the wood, the wood compost certainly did very well there. And you can see in the picture at the top, that's a kind of a picture of the lettuce trials. The leek trials are in the background. You can see just clearly there. This is kind of some weeks on after germination. Some of the treatments was clearly doing much better than others. And indeed, in the graph at the bottom, you can see the ones that did poorest were the ones which had the extruded wood in. All the ones with the best one was just the wood compost on its own, or the wood chip compost on its own. Adding increasing amounts of vermiculite made it perform slightly worse, but not sort of significantly so. But adding the extruded wood was a disaster basically. So that wasn't so good. But having said that, when we planted them out in the field, you can see that on the right hand picture, there's less like a kind of a block of lettuces, and even the teeny tiny lettuces really came good. And so by the time they were smaller at harvest, but really they all made reasonable lettuces. So it just goes to show not to be too downhearted by what things look like at the transplant stage, because there is certainly scope for them to come good later on. So that's just one of the we've done other ones. This is just a kind of an example that I've shown you of some of the growing trials. So if we move on to the next slide, I can just say briefly a little bit about some of the chemical analysis that we've done. If you look, first of all, thinking about the available nitrogen, which is often considered to be limiting, often a reason why people might apply a feed. The starting materials, it was relatively low concentrations kind of on day one when the seeds were sown, but we measured the concentration of mineral nitrogen, so that's the nitrate nitrogen and the ammonium nitrogen. We measured that repeatedly over a period of 3 months just to sort of see what would happen, and it's fairly obvious that that there was a lot of there was a big rise in the mineral nitrogen in the growing media over that time. We didn't have to. This was in the absence of plants. We didn't. If we'd had plants growing in there, they would have taken up some of the nitrogen and so confused the picture. So these were just empty pots that we had, but we kept them watered and kind of in the same greenhouse as the growth trials. But you can see both the wood chip compost and where we had vermiculite, the concentrations rose over that 3 month period. In the presence of the certainly of the high rates of the extruded wood, it fell right away to nothing, and that's obviously the reason why why there was very poor performance. But again, in the extruded wood, as in Tolly's trial or Tolly's graphs, the wood chip compost clearly contained, by the end of things, more available nitrogen than the commercial control compost growing media. We did measure other things. This is just an example. This is electrical conductivity, and this is just at the start. And you can see there that the highest concentration or the highest amounts of conductivity were in the Melcourt growing media. And I think this is probably the reason why why there was a relatively poor germination of the lettuces. There was conductivity is often due to potassium in the growing media, soluble potassium ions, and that can inhibit. You can have too much of a good thing, and that can inhibit the germination of seedlings. So that's probably the explanation for that. And I think if we move on, yes, that's the end of the actual results I'm going to show you. If people want to discuss more of the put some questions about some of those things, we can tell you a bit more about it. But at the moment, I think we'll hand over now to Margie Lennartson, who's going to tell you particularly about the kind of sort of assessments of the environmental impact of different growing media and different growing media ingredients. So over to Margie.
Hello there. I don't know, do I need to do anything else to come up on the screen, or can you see me already? How does it work?
You're there.
Yeah, I'm there. Okay, that's great. I can just see you, Francis. So hello, everybody. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the responsible sourcing scheme, which has, as Studio already has mentioned, have come alive to the public this year, or will come alive to the public this year. I've been involved in the development for this for the last 10 years, so it's been a long time in development, and it's really a scheme that was sort of developed in response to the government setting the targets to phase out the use of peat. So this was the industry response, that they wanted to in order to phase out the use of peat, they wanted to make sure that the materials that are going to be used in growing media were going to be assessed on a sort of equal basis, so that we weren't phasing out peat using something different that perhaps came with different environmental issues or social issues. So it was really to take an overall look at all of the ingredients that we were going to use in growing media, and therefore have also included to evaluate peat within that. And although this scheme is mainly sort of used by the companies that produce commercially available growing media, both in the retail sector and for professional growers, I think that the framework for the scheme, or the framework that has been developed for the calculator, is a really useful tool to use in order to assess the ingredients that we use, even if we use home produced or on-farm produced growing media. So it just takes you through that sort of exercise of looking at the sustainability criteria for all the different ingredients. So I think it's just worth looking a bit at what the calculator. I don't know how many of you have actually come across it, but it's basically a calculator, if you like, that evaluates the ingredients based on 7 different criteria. So the energy use, the water use, whether the production process and process, the whole sort of supply chains, how socially compliant that is, how it affects habitat and biodiversity, pollution, renewability, and resource use efficiency. And all those aspects are sort of put together to be evaluated overall. But for each of these criteria, there are sort of very detailed decision trees that have been worked out, where you then score each of the material sort of one at a time. And so, for example, for your water use, you have to start by looking at what's the starting point of the production change, and then you take it all the way up to the mixing table of the growing media. And for example, for water use, that you actually have to go back and estimate the water use that's used in, for example, for CAWR, water use in the production of the coconut, all the way through to the processing for the coconut fiber, and then and you actually have to sort of evidence how much water use. It's not estimated in any way or guessed in any way. It's actually done on you have to evidence it by real values. So for each of these criteria, for each of these criteria, there are decision trees like that. I've just shown the water use here. On the next slide, if Judith can move it on, I think we'll have the energy use done in a similar way. Are you there, Judith? Oh. I can't see. Have you moved? Oh, that's great. Thank you. So this is it looks quite similar to the water use. You basically, to estimate the energy used in the production of the ingredient, you have to start for the ingredient by determining where the starting point is. And that's different for the different types of materials. And then you're looking at all the energy used all through the supply chain up to the mixing board. And again, you have to evidence that. So that includes things like transport of the materials, production of the materials, and any energy used within the production process. And similar for the habitat of biodiversity, there are really sort of quite complicated. Yes, we can see the green lines, Judith. Can you please move on to the next slide, please? For habitat and biodiversity, again, there are individual decision trees for a range of ingredients. So I'm showing you here the one for peat. And again, you can see there are very sort of detailed questions that takes you to a score of well, the highest score you can get is 20, that's the best, and the lowest score is 0. And you can see for most peat or for all peat products, you end up with a score of on a red here of between 0 to 4, basically. Okay, so that's the decision trees. Judith, can you move it on? So a range of the most commonly used ingredients now have been taken through this calculator. That the growing media manufacturers have done that. The scores are sort of undertaken by the manufacturers, but they are actually independently audited by an independent auditor. So there's no, so they are checked that they are all true. And here you can see, I've just given you some typical examples here of the materials or how the different materials will score. So I've included here wood fiber, and by that I mean either, well, there are a whole range of different wood fibers. It can be extruded wood, like you see in the picture at the bottom here, or it can be composted wood fiber from, you know, anything from you know, chipped wood to sawdust. So wood comes or wood fiber comes in lots of different ways. I've included a CAWR here, or coconut waste, a green compost, so from a local authority green waste collection scheme, a fine bark, and then I've compared that with peat. So these are just typical values. They obviously will score differently for different materials, or for different types of wood fiber, for example. But this is just to give you an impression of how they score. So you can see, for example, to start with, that peat is, I should have said as well, for each of these scores, you basically get they're scored on a scale from 0 to 20. And so 20 is the highest, that's the best value. And that gives you a green, and so 18 to 20 gives you a green, 0 to 5 gives you a red, and the others are in between. So you can see here for peat, that generally scores has not got such high energy use or water use to use it. Social compliance we can come back to. You can see a lot of them score red, and we can explain that in more detail. That's more of that's not necessarily to mean that they are non-compliant, but according to the calculator, they can't evidence that they are socially compliant. But for habitat and biodiversity, peat, all of the peat products produced or available in this country at the moment will score a red, basically. And pollution, they all also tends to score, all of the products tend to score, you know, are not very polluting, basically. And then on renewability is another aspect where where peat will always score a red, because that's basically scored on the basis of whether something is renewable within 5 years, 50 years, or 1,000 years. And as peat isn't renewable within 1,000 years, that will score a red. And then you can sort of compare, and then from the actual values under that yellow and green and orange, you can then work out the total score, and that then gives you whether the overall the score for peat or bark is red, and that's where another light green and dark green has also been introduced in the total scores. You can see here that green compost is generally the one that scores most greens, also scores highest amongst the products. Wood fiber can be quite variable depending on extruded wood tends to use a lot more energy, so that can sometimes go up to an amber. CAWR has always been there's always been doubts about CAWR, that it's energy consuming because it's transported a long time, but in fact the energy use and the way it's transported means that the energy consumed is not much greater than for green compost or wood fiber. Where CAWR sometimes scores badly is under water use, and that water use and that's mainly in the processing to produce the coconut fiber, and that water use can also then often be linked to pollution incidences, so that can score a bit higher on that. And then based on these, if we move on to the next slide, please, you can see how then the different ingredients, the ingredients of wood fiber, CAWR, green compost, or bark, they don't, as a growing media, there is often mixtures of these. So then the calculator works out for you what's an overall score for a mixture, depending on the proportion of these materials here. So you can see, as an example here, I've used mix 1. If that's green compost at 20% mixed with peat at 80%, the overall score for that product would still be a red. And then as a very dark green, for example, if I mix green compost with wood fiber, might not work from a technical point of view in terms of producing a good growing media, but that would produce a dark green overall score. And it's those overall scores that are then part of the labeling for the growing media that's going to be on sale. So as I said, this has been produced to primarily for use for commercial media, and you see some of the media that organic growers can be using, but no, we'll hopefully go through this calculator. The Melcourt materials have gone through, but their scores are still awaiting verification, so they're not available on the website yet. Fertile Fiber and Glassman, as far as I know, there are no scores available for those yet, but there are a couple of other materials that have been approved for use in organic production, and there are also sort of I would say sort of the new generation of peat-free media, usually based on some sort of composted wood or wood byproduct material. And as you can see, for these two that I found that were available on the website at the moment, they both score a dark green, basically. On the bags, when you buy them in the shop, you're not likely to see the little overall scores directly, but there's meant to be a barcode that you can then look up to actually check how the scores work, basically. So although if we are producing our own growing media, I'm obviously aware that we're not perhaps interested in how the overall media score. But as I said, the framework within the calculator is really useful for us to take a sort of a check on the materials that we are mixing. So if you move on to the next score, what we've tried to do within Organic Plus, working with Tolly's mixture, we've tried to take the wood chip compost through the the responsible sourcing calculator, just to see really how that will compare with other ingredients that could be used, and also then to be able to select select ingredients that we may mix it with, because we are obviously aware that a lot of people, I mean particularly gardeners as well, often use their own compost to produce a growing medium, but often that compost needs to be diluted and something needs to be added to it to make it into a good growing medium. And that's when it's difficult, that you might need to, like in Tolly's case, he buys in vermiculite to mix into the growing medium, and that's when the calculator becomes useful in order to check what would be the best ingredients in terms of sustainability to mix into. Now, we haven't finished all the calculations and gone through it in any great details yet for the wood chip compost, but the initial results, I mean, obviously, as you would expect, look very promising. The energy used for the compost within the calculator, as the wood chip comes from a very local tree surgeon, it comes directly from the site where it's chipped in the field to the farm. So the starting point doesn't actually start until it has arrived on Tolly's farm, so where it's already chipped. So it's really only the energy that's used for turning the compost a few times and then for sieving it out, or for sieving it at the end, that would be considered. So that's likely, when we've gone through the actual figures of diesel and energy used, that we are going to score. It's going to score a dark green there. I'm quite confident about an 18 or a 20, because it's going to be below the minimum threshold. There's no water used at all, so that scores a dark green. With regards to social compliance, as I said before, that's a bit of a difficulty within the calculator at the moment, because in the calculator that works in terms of that you can only get a really high score if you have a externally audited social compliance process in place, and for many of the UK produced materials, which are by retailers deemed low risk in terms of social compliance, those externally audited systems are not in place. And because you can't evidence that, you have to go down what's called a self-assessment route, where you basically fill in that you belong to all sort of employment regulations and things like that. But that still only gives you an amber score, so that's why that is likely to remain at amber. With regards to habitat and biodiversity, because the wood chip is a recycled plant waste, the same as for green waste compost or green compost, that scores 20. So there's going to be no question about that. And then with regards to pollution, although this type of windrow composting that Tolly is using, there is obviously some potential to have some pollution in terms of leachates and in terms of the odors, for example, but as long as Tolly can show that he is mitigating that pollution, and which he is, because he's composting very dry material, very woody material, so there's not any sort of leachate from it. And as long as he can evidence that he's taking those mitigations, that again at least takes him down to a yellow mark for pollution incident, which is the same as how most other materials, particularly green waste compost, scores as well. With regards to renewability, he will score a 20 because the material is renewable. If not within 1 year, it's within 5 years, because it's obviously prunings from trees that are coming in. And with regards to resource use efficiency, well, the resource use efficiency is based around how much waste there is produced in the production process. So, for example, for green compost, which I've compared the wood chip compost with, there can be quite a high proportion of waste that's screened out at the end of the process. So plastic contaminants, other contaminants, which in a green waste composting plant is often taken to be landfill. So that it's the proportion of that waste of the production that can bring that down. But in terms of the setup at Tolly's place, there is basically no waste. He claims that he produced, I think it was a cycling helmet you found in it once, and that was reused. So there's basically no waste, at least absolutely no waste going to landfill from it. So again, that would score a 20. So you can see that's any home produced compost will score really well in the calculator. But then, of course, the vermiculite, which has not officially been taken through the calculator yet, and it's not something that we can do. It needs to be done by the vermiculite producers. But vermiculite will not score that well. It's very likely to score a red, both for habitat and biodiversity, as most minerals do, mined minerals, basically. And it's not renewable it's not renewable, basically. So it will score a red there as well. Vermiculite is probably also going to score very high, at least an amber, on energy use, because this is, of course, an expanded mineral, which is expanded under heat. So mixing that in at 30% will probably reduce the overall score for the wood chip compost. Making it into a growing medium will reduce that significantly, and hence that's why we try to sort of look at other materials that could be mixed in with a wood chip compost instead. Okay, but probably better move on. We can come back to it if anyone is more interested. There's another, just to finish off with them, what I wanted to say was that within Organic Plus, we're obviously trying to, and indeed, as I've done all through my career at Garden Organic and wherever, try to phase out the use of peat. And we would really sort of argue that it's now really becoming very urgent for the organic movement to really try to phase it out. And ideally, we would like this to be done with immediate effect, that we stop using peat straight away. We obviously realize that some processes need to be put in place within the standards, so that we it would have to be more realistic to put a target to 2025. And if we took a target to have peat phased out within organic production by 2025, at least then that would give the organic growers an opportunity to take a lead on this environmental issue, to really demonstrate that we are doing this earlier than other growers, and we are taking sort of the environmental responsibility seriously here. If we don't do it by 2025, we absolutely must do it before 2028, which I think is now going to be the new target date that's going to be used in the UK. And because if we don't do it by 2028, we will basically run the risk that the organic standards would be superseded by the national regulations, which I'm sure you would agree would not be a good look for sorry, this is my phone going off.
Turn your phone off, Margie.
Yes. In the middle of it. Sorry, I just had to disappear and throw it out. So yes, I'm basically urging it all to, even if we can't officially get peat moved out from the standards, at least stop using it, so that we've done it by effect in organic production. Because as I said, I'm sure it's not going to be a good look if organic growers are amongst the last to be using peat in their production systems. So I would therefore urge you all also to, there's currently a consultation, but by a government consultation, asking about ending the retail sale of peat in horticulture in England and Wales. And I think that's very important that we are, as organic growers, really respond to that and urge everybody that, don't stick to having as shorter targets as we can have and then get it banned from use. In the retail sector, they are now proposing by 2024, and then in the commercial sector by 2028. And I think Judith has put a link to the government consultation down here as well. So that's all I had to say. Let's do questions. Well, unless you've got something more to say here about the resources, Judith.
Not particularly. It's not exhaustive. The top one there is the HTA report that we produced at it was CAWR and another one of Coventry's research centres. I think Phil can make these all available, but there's links to some of the people that have meant things that some people have mentioned in the chat, like the Responsible Sourcing Scheme website. We've got the Peat-free April website on there as well. I think Beth Otway's actually with us this evening, so hello Beth. Also Garden Organic's campaign for Pete's sake. And yeah, the government consultation, we went through this the other day at CAWR, we're preparing a response, and we would urge other people to as well. Quite a lot of the questions that they're asking, it kind of looks like they maybe are angling to keep peat. So yeah, we've kind of, we're in the middle of preparing our answers, but I think at every stage, because they are proposing some alternatives to a ban possible, or the way that the questions are written, it kind of looks like they're trying to test the water with alternatives to a ban. So we were kind of, we think it needs to be filled in cautiously, because we don't want to fill in anything that would encourage the government to think that they can not ban it. Just the way that the questions are written, and they are looking for input from stakeholders. So anyone that's growing, anyone that's using growing media, and if you do fill in the consultation as well, you know, talk as if you matter, because you do, and your opinion and your will to phase out peat is needed to help. But yeah.
Okay, thank you, Judith. Our panelists have been doing a good job of going through some of the questions and answers, questions as they've come through, both on the chat and in the chat box. There's a couple to start with I wanted to pick up on, and one is about growing plants that like low pH, and what and how we can deal with how we can get composts that are suitable for those plants where at the moment peat is the only possibility. Anyone got any thoughts on that?
Well, commercially, I don't know, I could have a stab at the question. Commercially, some of the peat-free media have now been produced for plants that like low pH, and I think they are primarily based on the wood fibers of different kinds. So I think the problem comes with when we are using composted materials, the compost there is often very alkaline, so they're not suitable. But if they use other ingredients, and I think even to some extent barks have been used, I mean, the problem with those materials is that those commercial media, they have not yet been formulated for use in organic production. And I think that's a big problem that we are facing now if we want to buy in growing media for organic producers. There are a lot of peat-free media that have been produced, what I generally refer to them as the sort of the new generation of peat-free media, containing the extruded woods, the new formulations basically. But most of the companies that produce those and put them on the market have not formulated them for organic production, i.e. they are formulated with artificial fertilizers. And that's a bit of a dilemma that we have, that the range of peat-free media that we have available to buy is fairly low, basically.
And a slightly related one that I kind of think in my mind relates is about the use of moorland gold compost, which is obviously people that aren't in the UK won't know that is a kind of reclaimed peat product. I mean, do you think there's possibility of of marketing, keeping those reclaimed peat products for specific uses like acid-loving plants?
Yes, I mean, I guess the reclaimed peat, or the moorland gold, or the reclaimed peat, or the sap propels, as they're sometimes called, that they are acceptable for use within organic production, and they would also score in terms of the calculator. It's regarded as a recycled peat, so that would be acceptable. You wouldn't score a red for habitat and biodiversity. Although I think there are question marks, and we were discussing that the other day, isn't it, with regards to how that peat is reclaimed, and whether the practices on the moorlands, whether the best practices of the moorlands are used, and to what extent they influence that material becoming available. So I think it's something we need to keep an eye on. But I mean, I don't know offhand what the pH of the moorland products is, if that is acidic and would ever be suitable. But I guess that would be a sensible use of it if that's the case.
And also, I think it's not, whatever bad things go on in the moors in terms of kind of burning for improve the habitat for grouse and things like that. It's not that's nobody does that in order to promote erosion and to get the peat into the reservoirs so you can dredge it out. They're going to be dredging it out anyway. And so it would kind of be a waste product. They'd have to dump it if they couldn't sell it as peat. So I don't think it's not that bad, I don't think. Apart from maybe from a sort of public relations point of view, as a kind of a way of, sort of as a loophole, you might say.
Yeah, there's one other question which is relates to sort of the use of green waste compost versus woodchip compost, and somebody said that the green waste compost is more or less sterile. So how can that compare in terms of, can it be a fungally active, biologically active product?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, because this is something I've wondered about a lot with our own composting, because we get temperatures up to, well, I mean, regularly 70, 75, and we've been as high as 80, 83, and you think, well, this is going to kill everything. But the fungi somehow seems to survive, and it certainly comes back to repopulate the heat once the temperatures go down. I presume the same situation with green waste compost. The problem with green waste compost is actually the CN ratio is often quite poor, because it does contain a lot of woody material, which is the composting process they do on these large sites is done very fast, and the material is really not ready for use as potting compost. So you would have to recompost it again for a period of possibly a year to make it suitable to get the CN ratio right. But the fungi seem to survive whatever.
I think it's quite easy for them to if conditions are suitable for them, they'll re-inoculate, as the temperatures fall away, they'll come in, the spores are floating around in the air all the time. If it's in a pile on the ground, they'll come up from below. I think if the conditions suit it, they'll come back.
Certainly, I think, and for the smaller producer, there's every reason why you couldn't just be using these large dumpy bags as a means of breaking down your wood chip. It does seem to work very well, despite the fact it's not even on soil. It still seems to work perfectly well. We've done a few trials with that, and the material is just as good. It takes longer. It takes about two to 3 years to break down properly, and the more you have together in terms of number of bags touching each other, the quicker that process is. But there's no reason why it couldn't be done on quite a small scale. You don't have to turn it. The turning does speed the process up, and it gives you a more homogeneous mix, but it's not, I don't think it's essential to turn it, but it certainly helps.
Yeah, I think I mean, obviously from a sustainability point of view, the green waste compost is good to use. Commercial growing media mixers, they had a phase of using a lot of it in the, whenever that was, in the 90s, I guess it was, early 2000s, and I think have sort of gradually it looks to me that they are moving away from it a bit. They're certainly using it in lower proportions, so they might be putting in 20% of a green waste compost. But and they do that because they all say it's very variable. I'm not entirely sure that that's very true, but I think it's what they definitely need to do is to make sure that they work with a growing meat or a green waste producer who is, you know, i.e. from sort of one source, that they don't get it in from a great mixture of them, and for many of them the contamination is too high for the material to be acceptable for use in a commercial growing media. It's things like glass and sharps that can still
and
be,
herbicides as well,
and herbicides, yeah. But it's important to know that they should, that for using a green waste compost in a as a growing medium, don't only look for the PAS 100 accreditation. There is a special, I can't remember offhand what it's called now, but there is a special guidance for green waste compost to be used as a growing media ingredient, which is basically higher standards for the material, so lower limit levels both for contaminants and weeds and all that sort of thing. And yeah, yes, that there is this sort of risk of herbicide persistence in green waste persisting in green waste compost. Not quite sure how widespread that really has been. There's certainly been scares around it, but I think, I mean, ultimately we are going to have to learn to use it because there's a lot of it, and I think from a physical point of view, it's quite suitable to be used in a growing media purposes.
There was another question.
It is readily available as well.
Yes, yeah.
There was another question on whether on using anaerobic digestate or the product of anaerobic digestate as a ingredient in growing media.
Yes, I forgot to say that. I was meant to mention that. Sort of at the moment, the most commonly used materials is wood fiber, green compost, bark, and CAWR. They are what most mixes contains at the moment. But the really sort of up and coming recent material is anaerobic digestate. And indeed, there are already a few commercial growing media that contains that. And in fact, in the calculator, there is a new tree and a new example that has been built in for assessment of anaerobic digestate.
I mean, the supplementary question to that was, you know, is that pose an ethical dilemma in terms of, you know, the sort of acres of maize and so on that go into producing digestate?
I think you're right. That definitely needs to be looked at. What the sort of the overall energy use is,
and land use.
Yeah, and land use. Yeah.
I think also it can be used in different ways because you can separate out the actual fibers have kind of, you know, can be quite peat-like in a physical sense, and that's one way of using it. But I think I wasn't quite sure from that question. You could obviously add the whole liquid digestate to sort of soak it into wood chip, and that would probably accelerate the process. Whether or not that would be a good thing, but that could be another way of using it. So it's that, you know, it's not just one thing. There's different possibilities of using it in different ways.
Thank you. There's some interesting comments coming through on the chat as well on this as we speak from Audrey Littrick on using anaerobic digestic fibre as a growing media because it can be very nutrient rich and must be greatly diluted.
We tested some, and it was very high in ammonia, you know, so it obviously needs, I mean, that, you know, you could work around that and maybe add other things and have it as a component or mature it for longer and all of that. But yes, to be used with caution, I think.
Has anyone got any experience of seaweed? That's come up as for those people that are near the coast that may be able to have access to it. No.
The problem with seaweed, Phil, is it has a very low sort of carbon content, and it's sort of very slimy. you'd have to compost it with other material.
Yeah. Okay. We've only got about 3 minutes left. So is there any of you got any questions that you'd like to answer that you've seen on the chat or on the Q&A before, as a final thing before we close? Final comments? No?
There's one at the end which says Iain Tolhurst would like to answer this question live.
Oh.
So, no, that's a mistake.
Oh, right.
It's about coffee grounds waste. Is that being answered?
Oh, is it?
Yeah. Is that the one, or is it
No.
something?
That was about the C/N ratio.
Oh yeah. Which one was that? Tell me. Give me the question.
It says it's good to know that 15:1 is an ideal C/N ratio. Is that what your woodchip compost typically is? I'm surprised it's so low.
I was going to answer that one. I must have pressed the wrong box or something. But yeah, typically it is around 15:1. It does vary a bit, but we've had it as low as 10 or 12:1, which is possibly even better. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how low it needs to go. The lower it is, I think, up to a point that perhaps the better for propagation. The blacker the compost, the lower the CN ratio. I've got to realize by the color what the CN ratio is. When it gets really black and really fine, the CN ratio is high. We don't test every batch. We have tests every year or two, but yeah, typically 15:1. Beyond that, I wouldn't perhaps want to use it if I thought it's higher than that, because you will get nitrogen lockup if it's beyond sort of 15-20:1.
Okay. Well, I think we realised we're probably not going to be able to. There are going to be some questions that haven't been answered, and we've tried to do as much as we can. And there's probably more questions have come up as we've gone through. But I was wondering, in terms of whether, I know there had been some talk about, is how do we follow this up? There was some discussion in the chat about people pooling their experiences of using different recipes and trials and for the organic grower. I mean, there was also talk at one point about a field lab. Is that a possibility? I don't know if one of you, Judith or Margie or Francis, want to say anything about that.
That's certainly something that was talked of about a year ago. Becky from Innovative Farmers was trying to get something together on this subject. So I think if growers want to approach Innovative Farmers, I'm sure that would be something. It's obviously an important topic. I'm sure it's something they'd be keen to take forward.
But because it's kind of grower initiated research, so there needs to be kind of a ground. We can obviously be involved, but there needs to be a groundswell of people asking. And I know that there have been other field labs before, but they were definitely keen to do another one. So just drop Innovative Farmers a line, or even a tweet or anything if you're keen on doing another peat field lab or exploring a particular area. And yeah.
I mean, it's something perhaps we can people can feedback if I think there is there will be a feedback form that we'll send through to all participants, and if that's something that you're interested in, then perhaps people could respond in there, or email me at OGA or anyone on the panel. That would be fine. So we will follow it up with them. I'll try and extract all the links that you've had in here and the presentation, so that you can look at those at your leisure, and you'll be able to watch the recording as well. And then I think there are lots of we've seemed to have barely scratched the surface. I think there's an ongoing conversation we can have on all of these. On a lot of the things that we've talked about tonight, but it's great to see so many people here and such a commitment to finding a solution to removing peat from organic production. yeah, and we have to, as growers, take a stand on that and be shown to be doing the right thing. So thank you everyone. Thank you particularly to our panelists, to Judith, Margie, and Francis from CAWR, and to Tolly. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. And thanks to Sinead for backing me up on this and helping out with the tech side of it. So yeah, please fill the feedback forms when they get sent through, and enjoy the rest of your evening. So thank you all for joining us.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, it's been really good. Yeah.
All right then. Goodbye.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Okay. Bye.